today, my topic is the love that rules the universe. And we're talking about chapter 1. Now, Swedenborg calls it God the Creator. Now, in it, to start with, he refutes two ideas that he comes across, he's familiar with in his contemporary society. The first is from the church, and it is the Trinity of persons. This is the first idea that he refutes. And so he's talking about this idea that God is believed to be one God in three persons, and he says that this thinking ends by their thinking that there is no God. And he says this alone is the source of the nature worship prevalent today. That's quite an accusation. Elsewhere, a couple of paragraphs further on, paragraph 23, he says this: to put in the mind of a small child the idea of three divine persons, which inevitably carries with it the idea of three gods, is to take away all spiritual suckling, and then all spiritual nourishment, and finally all spiritual rationality, and to bring about the spiritual death of those who become convinced of it. He's very strong on this point. Now, I want you to bear in mind that the title of the first three chapters of the book are God the Creator, the Lord the Redeemer, and the Holy Spirit and the way God works. So, given everything that I've just said, I want you to hold on to the fact that he does actually talk about a Trinity in a form, but he's attacking the particular form that he sees in the church of his day. So just hang on to that idea in everything that we read. The second idea that he refutes is the idea that God stands separate from the universe. Now, I wonder if you've heard of deism. Does anybody know the term deism? So deism is the idea that God created the world and then stepped back. So he created it and let it run its own course and had no further involvement in it whatsoever. It's an idea that was very popular in Swedenborg's day. I believe it's an idea that Swedenborg himself toyed with in his early career. And it's very convenient. If you think about the science that is exploding in Swedenborg's time, it's very convenient if you no longer have to account for God when you're examining the world that you're looking at. It takes out one of those variables that makes it so hard to think about what's going on. So science becomes a matter of the measurable, observable universe and nothing more. We don't need to worry about this mysterious figure in the background of God who might be pulling the strings and controlling all the puppets and so on. The problem with deism is that once you accept its principles, you throw out several things. You throw out the idea of miracles. Miracles cannot happen if God does not have any impact upon the world that he's created. You throw out the divinity of Jesus Christ because God cannot incarnate into the world because he stepped back from it. And you cannot accept the Bible as divine text either because God would not do that. He's stepped back. He's not having any further involvement. So eventually, and the logical consequence is that God becomes irrelevant, redundant, and eventually he is dismissed as non-existent. You can see how that plays out. So Swedenborg really goes to town on this idea throughout this chapter. Here's one of the things that he writes. Those who attribute everything to nature say this because they have turned their minds away from thinking about the divine. And he continues, this turning away from the divine prevents them from thinking rationally, much less spiritually, about the amazing sights they see in nature. Their thoughts are limited to the senses and matter, so that they think in nature, from nature, rather than above her. So, to put it another way, what Swedenborg presents in this chapter is these two ideas. God is one, not divided. And God is active and present, not absent. Okay? And these become the fundamental ideas that Swedenborg is trying to get across in this chapter. So he says, a couple more quotes for you just to illustrate. There are two things that make up the essence of God, love and wisdom. As I have shown above, love and wisdom are one in God. It is love which wills these things, and wisdom that puts them into effect. And then he also says, this is about the second point, that he's present and active. Since the making of the world, God is non-spatially in space and non-temporally in time. You can scratch your head about that one. It's quite hard to get your head around, isn't it? But let's continue. Every created object is finite, and the infinite is contained in the finite objects as in receivers, and human beings as images of it. So the question then is, what is the one principle that is present and active in creation? What is it that we receive from God? And Swedenborg's answer is love and wisdom. And in particular, he dwells upon love. So if I go back to paragraph 43, we had a little bit of a look at some of it. Here's another little snippet. There are two things which make up the essence of God, love and wisdom. But there are three things which make the essence of his love. Loving others than oneself, wishing to be one with them, and devoting oneself to their happiness. And for Swedenborg, this love is the reason the universe has been created. And it's the reason and the order in which it is maintained as well. The properties of the divine love were the reason the universe was created and are the reason it is preserved in existence. So if you want to sum up that whole chapter in one word, it's love. It's as simple as that. It is love. Now, I want to relate it to our Bible readings. We've already had the idea of the image of God, that the container that we are, the receivers of God's love. But I want to talk about this verse at the end of chapter 5. And this always reminds me of Reverend Ian Arnold, because I remember the way he emphasised this particular point. Therefore you shall be perfect just as your Father in heaven is perfect. Now the word is not perfect. It's not perfect. The Greek word is teleos. Now this is, if I look up a concordance, it means this. It means having reached its end. In other words, complete, or by extension, perfect. So they've taken this word and they've made it perfect because it's an implication of the word, but I think part of the reason they don't want to make it whole, which is what it should be, whole and complete, is this idea of this Trinity that leaks into the mind of the translators. That's my suggestion. I could be entirely wrong. But God is not divided, do you remember? God is whole. And that's what we need to learn from this verse. See, the way that God works, the way that he governs the universe, must be utterly consistent with himself. God cannot contradict himself. He has to be whole, one, complete. And the nature of that completeness is love. It's very simple. So as we read through Matthew chapter 5, that section that I read, it's really an invitation by the Lord to be like God, to be undivided in our love. Because the only way for us to be with God, to be children of God, is to be like God. Now, I want you to bear that in mind as I just reread some of those words from Matthew chapter 5, this idea of being one in love, undivided. You have heard that it was said to those of old, "You shall not swear falsely, but shall perform your oaths to the Lord. But I say to you, do not swear at all, but let your yes be yes, and your no be no. For whatever is more than these is from the evil one." Be undivided. I say to you, love your enemies. Bless those who curse you. Do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven, for he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. For if you love those who love you, what reward have you? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet your brethren only, what do you do more than others? Do not even the tax collectors do so? Therefore you shall be whole, just as your Father in heaven is whole. Now, the fly in the ointment of all of that is the idea of hell. If you talk to people about, God is love, they almost inevitably bring up hell. Well, what's hell about? How can you say God is love if he sends people to hell? Well, the thing is, he doesn't. God does not send people to hell. We are intended to be an active recipient and expression of love. That's what it means to be an image of God. An active recipient and expression of love. Hell is the state of being without God, without love, in other words. We're not excluded from heaven. We exclude ourselves by our unwillingness to love. Our unwillingness to receive and express love is what puts us in hell. And so Swedenborg is very firm on this idea that the state of hell is a state of our own choosing. And as we read through this chapter, actually, I will mention, one of the things he says is, God is continually working against us. He makes that point. He's continually working against us because we draw ourselves in one direction, the hellish, the selfish direction, and he's always trying to draw us in the heavenly, good, loving direction. So there's this great opposition that goes on, but it's not because God's trying to put us in hell. He's trying to draw us into heaven. People excommunicate themselves. So far as a man lives under divine guidance, that is, allows himself to be led by God, so far does he become more and more inwardly an image of God. A human being is an organ capable of receiving God, and its capability as an organ depends upon its capacity to receive. The divine influence does not penetrate further than the extent to which a person clears the way or opens the door. So, for this week, what I'm going to ask you to do is just consider that in all of your actions, are you an active recipient and expression of love? It's not being swayed by others or circumstances or, any of the other things that happen around us. It's about being true to one principle, one fundamental that rules our lives. It's our choice. God will leave us in absolute freedom, as we'll find later in the book. But to be led by the Lord is to be led by love.